Dr. Flick, ladies and gentlemen, I'm wearing two hats here and I'm happy. On the one hand, I've been invited to give you an introduction for the first roundtable up here, and secondly, I've been invited to be the host, which is what I am happy to do. On the one hand, because this is an extremely exciting topic we're having here on our agenda, and secondly, because Mr. Foos has introduced the topic very well. Powerlessness and power. Now, that's an extremely important topic. And we've talked about individual aspects yesterday and today. The question is, where do you see power? In what fields, in which sectors do we find it, and how is it being exercised? I would like to mention companies, politics, lobby groups, pressure groups, the media, swarm intelligence, and uncontrolled or uncontrollable combinations of interest groups. I mean, these aspects matter quite a bit when it comes to policy consulting and counseling, as Mr. Foos has said already. But we are dealing with very complex challenges today in many fields. I'm thinking of Greece, of Ukraine, the climate change, and there are numerous crises which need to be solved by politicians who then resort to the advice given by consultants, by experts. Now, of course, it's a necessary relationship we see between politicians and experts, but on the other hand, there is also a lot of disappointment, and there are reproaches, there is criticism, also because there are too many opinions. I would like to quote Churchill with respect to Keynes. Churchill said that he gets 4 opinions when asking 3 economists, and he gets 2 of the 4 from Keynes. So it's not only about economists who have different opinions, but sometimes one and the same economist has different opinions. The question is, what does this mean for us in real terms? What about the historic development of the relationship of experts and politics, and how can we design the process of counseling in an optimum way so that we get the best possible results? Let's have a look at 2 criteria in particular: independence and expertise. It's very clear that counseling can only be fruitful if the counselor, the expert, is an expert, i.e. if he or she provides of the knowledge to offer reasonable and knowledgeable advice. But then we've also seen in the financial crisis that banks, i.e. the agencies identified as the ones to be blamed for the crisis, were the ones who were asked, first of all, what needs to be done in order to get out of the crisis. In other words, banks were considered the experts in spite of the fact that we did not know whether these banks were independent counselors without vested interests. And that's interesting, also because we look at the international sphere too. What about the situation in other countries? Do they organize the counseling process different from us? Revolving doors, that's a subject matter that has been a subject matter in the United States for a long time, i.e. experts who become politicians and then go back and act as experts again. The question is, someone who works for a government institution and then goes back to the private economy, can such a person be an independent expert, consultant, when there is a need? Well-meant Lobbying is another item on our agenda. What about lobbying in terms of corruption when it comes to vested interests without any general welfare, without the public in mind? There are many tricky aspects, I should say. And in order to wrap up here, I would like to quote Gustav Rapp, who allegedly said that politics spoils your character. No, politics tries or tests your character. This is about the framework conditions and which framework conditions we need in order to offer effective counseling to politicians, and what can we do in order to shape the dialogue of economics and politics so that everybody benefits. Let me introduce the panelists to you. Mr. Fust has spoken to you already, but I'm happy to welcome Professor Koriot, holder of the chair for public law at the Ludwig-Maximilians University in Munich. Next to the empty chair, you see Professor Schön. I mean, an empty chair is quite important. Think of the corporate governance dimension. Anyway, Professor Schön is with the Max Planck Institute in Munich, and he's also the DFG president. And then I'm happy to welcome Professor Christoph Paulus of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Restructuring, and he's teaching Roman law at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And I will find a chair for me whilst you give our guests a hand. My first question goes to Mr. Koriot. May I ask you, what has changed in the relationship between politics and scientific counseling? And what has happened in the last few decades, I wonder? Now, first of all, we need to bear in mind that the relationship between sciences and politics has never been a static one. It's always been dynamic. It's not a relationship that has reached a point and has never changed thereafter. There are different phases, and these phases happen and re-happen too. So the whole process moves on but returns to phases of the past as well. I would like to identify two clear stages which show what I'm talking about, and the important criterion to distinguish is sometimes there is more of a distance, sometimes there is less of a distance between sciences and politics, sometimes there is more attention, sometimes there is less. Now that's the difference between the different stages or phases. The first epoch gets me back to Karl Schiller. Mr. Fust has mentioned him, and that's the 1960s in Germany, but all Western democracies could be mentioned. There was a lot of harmony in the relationship between politics and sciences for very clear reasons. People believed in progress, a belief which was only shattered at the end of the 1960s, and the overall idea that we need to scientify all spheres of life. The conviction that economic growth after World War II will continue for good, that's another important distinguishing factor. Now, in such an era, it's easy to imagine that politics and sciences live in harmony and that politicians love to listen to the advice offered by scientists and scholars. You can also see it that from the fact that lots of think tanks were founded in the 1960s, and for the first time ever, the Federal Republic of Germany established a Ministry for Sciences, which was meant to focus on social and societal developments from a scientific perspective. And then I would like to come back to Karl Schiller also for another reason, because he used to be an economist and then he became a politician. And all this fits the overall idea of harmony in the relationship between sciences and politics. But then there is a counter image we need to see, and that's the situation we are experiencing today. Both spheres don't know what to do, maybe. They expect too much from each other. Maybe in the more recent past there was a bit of a disappointment. Anyway, today in 2015, politics tend to criticize sciences and scientific advice and experts increasingly, and that's not about economics only. You also see it in other scientific fields. And sciences tend to criticize politics and to remind us of the fact that politics are about short-term decisions only, are about irrational decisions only, i.e. politics lacks scientific concepts. So in order to overcome the difficult phase we are in today, I'd like to suggest that we remember what can be done on both sides and forget about what cannot be done anyway. As far as the scientific sphere is concerned, scientists, experts have to accept that politicians decide, can decide, and must decide, and they are also allowed to decide without getting scientific advice. Maybe it's better for politicians to listen to counselors, but it doesn't have to. Politics have the right of action, and it's an independent right. On the other hand, scientists should be aware of the fact that the advice they can offer can be of help. And the multitude of different scientific opinions concerning one and the same problem can also be understood as one element of a democratic process, and could also be seen as one element or means of control, which is an important societal function. Thank you. Mr. Schoen, my next question goes to you. What about today? Where are we today? What's the situation? And what are the challenges and opportunities? Well, I can follow up on Clemens Fust and Stefan Koriot, because the relationship between sciences and politics has always been marked by tension. Nevertheless, we are experiencing a certain trend towards a hierarchy in which politics is at the top and sciences is below. Let me give you two examples, anecdotes, if you wish. Politics expect scientists to carry out research free from interest, and in particular politicians expect clear answers to question. Half a year ago, there was a conference hosted by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and this was about millions spent on scientific research. And then a representative of the ministry said, well, you know, we have spent millions for years on medical research, and then Ebola happens and nobody has an answer. Well, okay, that's what you hear from representatives of the government. And then, of course, you might love fundamental research, and the question for each and every scientist is, shouldn't we also focus on everyday problems? But then the overall picture is clear. Politics sets the agenda, determines and identifies the subject matters, and expects you to work. I mean, you can go and say, right, but they are paying for your studies, right? True. But then politicians often expect certain results and no others. Second anecdote. A few years ago in the German Bundestag, a scientist approached me and asked, "Who are you for here?" Wrong question, I thought, because I'm an expert. I'm not for anybody in the parliament. I can only try and help bring objective knowledge about. But here we see a problem, the problem we are facing today. Politicians don't consider experts independent anymore. Climate research was, so to speak, the turning point, if I may say so, because this was about global developments, and all of a sudden studies were used by companies and by politics, and the experts belong to one camp or the other. However, Mr. Fust and Mr. Coriot have reminded you already that we need an acceptance for the multitude, or for the pluralism of opinions, and that's not part of the problem, that's part of the solution. So this is not about the vested hidden interests of individuals, but this is about an invitation to an open conversation in order to find out what solutions can be offered to politicians. Right, we will certainly talk about this particular aspect in a minute. But I would like to ask Mr. Paulus now, because several decades ago you focused on an exciting theme which nobody was interested in Europe, and that was about the insolvency regulations for nations. Now, your approach has been praised by many. However, your suggestions have not been put into practice. What is your experience with politics?
Surely this is a difficult question. However, it is easy to answer. The experience I gained was a frustrating one. Now, against the backdrop of the model Mr. Fust mentioned, at least. But let me come back to what we heard about the variety or various opinions. This brief statement of René Obermann. And he talked about this issue. Being a CEO of Telecom, he said, there's a lot of information around, but then, and he called it intuition, now I'm going to process all this, and then I'm going to make a decision. I'm using my gut feeling, if you like. So this is something which maybe should be placed in the foreground more so than we've done in the past. You know, for 15 years, I have been, trying to further this idea. My impression is that politicians have got many, many interests. They play a role. These are legitimate interests. And they are completely different from the interests important to a scientist. And we heard that several times already. The idea would be if we could do things like this or that, that would be a good solution. Here we have got politicians. They think about re-election. They think about alliances which play a role. And I do not know what other, say, interconnections or interrelationships play a role in this respect. Sometimes politicians say, and there was a high-ranking politician who once said to me, Mr. Paulus, you are right. The situation which we face now, and that was in summer 2011, so in the midst of the crisis, this is something which has to be taken out of the hands of politicians. I consider this to be an interesting statement because this very politician made a statement and giving me the impression that an alien was talking. He said one of the stupidest phrases of all stupid phrases, and he said, this person, on the other hand, said that things like this should be taken out of the hands of politicians. I think it is necessary, and, it's necessary to bear in mind that you have to have a very, very long, say, kind of perseverance or stamina in handling things. Let me come back to one example which Mr. Fust mentioned. It is about this, this experts' council and minimum wages, etc., etc. I think we had the first responses of the politicians after a few hours or a few minutes even. One of the experts said that this does not tally with scientific research. So how is it possible that somebody can give such a clearly defined statement against the backdrop of such findings, and that all this is no longer, say, understandable if you take into account the economic situation? I think it was one of the assistants, chemical engineer or something like this. She did not say, I don't like this, but she said that this is not based on modern advanced scientific methods. Well, then you have to think about what are advanced scientific methods. But, you know, handling this question, this issue, was not a convincing way. It was not a convincing way of handling a thing like this. You know, scientists might or should have said that there's a wide spectrum of scientific research who emphasize this or that, who've got strong points, weak points, and that the final result might be a mixed picture. And the second step was that the experts' council said, we assess or evaluate this evidence like this or that. And I think there were two, say, blames or reproaches. Your methods are not modern, and second, you did not see literature. And, you know, that was wrong. We know most advanced methods, and we know the literature. But, you know, what they didn't like was that we read and interpret evidence like this. Now, can an expert council or committee do something like this? Like Mr. Obermann said, you know, a bit of intuition. But, you know, I go to see a doctor. I've got, say, a cold or influenza, and then, of course, the doctor can say, I've got so and so many studies, I've got so and so many types of drugs. The others say this drug works, and the others say it doesn't work. And if then the doctor would stop at this point, I would be disappointed. I expect the doctor to say, I recommend this or that drug. And this, of course, here, the personal trust or confidence in the doctor comes into play. So looking at politics, I could say, very well, very nice. Thank you very much for these explanations and interpretations of this evidence. It is not unambiguous, and therefore we see things different and maybe take a different decision. Yeah, maybe this is something which we should promote in the future. You know, how can we, say, trigger this kind of dialogue without this contradiction of opinions is considered to be complete befuddlement, complete confusion? How can we start a dialogue like this? Well, you know, it is difficult. I think we should define a kind of framework within which scientists and politicians can discuss things. And this means you also want to remove and eliminate efficiencies on both sides, or even exaggerated expectations should be eliminated, and then bring things or people together. Then we might succeed at the end of the day. Surely we have to take into account these times are difficult. These times are very difficult to, say, explain, and the cooperation between scientists and politicians might be difficult. But on the other hand, this might be the reason that it is very important to come up with, say, abstract notions, get away from, say, framework conditions, and create something like a protected space within which scientists and politicians can, say, develop and discuss things according to their own, say, basis. I think it is important that the scientists say, you know, where do we agree and where do we disagree? You know, looking at economic science and the presentation of the respective results in the public, you know, here, this huge plethora of, say, agreement is, say, exaggerated, and then it propagates dissent. I think it would be a good idea. Now, what about the dissent? In this respect, we must say that the public, including the press, as well as the politicians, have to go further in their deliberations. People who say, well, minimum wages and salaries work in France, then you have to have a closer look and find out what is the impact on young people, what is the impact on those who are pushed out of the marketplace. So in this case, I believe the politicians are, say, called upon to come up with a solution and then they can start demanding. Like Stefan, you just started to say, at this moment, I thought of things which we discussed this morning. I think we have to become aware of the fact that every discussion which we have here, the 5 people of us on this stage, is, influenced by the biographies. We are Germans, for instance, now the things which we are talking about, is this a specific German issue? Is it something which we can, say, globalize? All this is based on our own experience, but maybe this is something which we should bear in mind as well. And I cannot add much to that. Most of the things have been mentioned already. I believe, and this is what Wolfgang said before, what we have to do is we have to reach a point where there is a discourse, where there is even disagreement, and that we tolerate this, say, disagreement. We live in a kind of, say, Biedermeier era again. That is, we sit very cosily and comfortably in our living room and say we could change this, and we are all having a very harmonious discussion. I think this is the wrong approach. And let me pass on this to Mr. Fust. Just one footnote: how much of this discourse or discussion should be private? Policy advice behind closed doors? Well, I believe that it is about other things. There are certain issues and questions which can be discussed behind closed doors. Mr. Paulus, for instance, what about organizing an insolvency process for governments, etc., etc. These are suggestions and ideas which are discussed, certainly, and behind doors. Maybe this is a good idea, also against the backdrop of the capital market as a whole. But wherever things become critical and wherever there is dissent, here, under such circumstances, I believe the public is important. And this applies to politicians as well. If Mrs. Merkel wants to assert herself, then she has to go to the public, has to convince the public or stakeholders or the European partners. One comment on this idea about this fruit-bearing dissent or discourse. And this is something which I emphasized. I believe it is not so easy for the politicians. Leadership is an aspect. Leadership of a company, for instance. In this case, the manager, the leader of this company, has to define the way ahead. Mrs. Merkel is doing it like this. She avoids the moment of taking a decision. She is very skilled in doing so. You always have the impression that everything is open. But the very next second, this decision is a thing of the past. And maybe in strategic terms, this is a very clever approach. But because she's doing that, we forget things in Germany. The Biedermeier, this term, the Biedermeier era, this is a good point. Here we have a leader who stands at the helm of the government and says, okay, we're going to handle things like this. And if you do not handle things like she does, then she wouldn't be a federal chancellor any longer. At this point, Mrs. Merkel cannot say there are arguments for continuing the euro. There are other arguments against the continuation of the euro. So she has to define a way forward, a way which other people will then follow. I think it is important that she also accepts that there are different opinions, good reasons for one or the other. But, the Bundestag, the federal government, against the backdrop of all this evidence, took a decision, and this is a decision which we are going to adhere to stick to. Let me, say it in a more, say, poignant way. In the United States, for instance, we have the Council of Economic Advisors, the counterpart of the Expert Council in Germany. They give advice, and this means they are closer to decisions and to the deliberations on this level. Don't you think this would be a good idea to have something like this in Germany as well? America or in the States, I think the discussion over there is in different waters. My colleague Helm said, what is the difference between Germany and the United States when looking at policy advice? Economics is considered to be a science. In Germany, economics is considered to be a kind of a sect. Now, what did he mean? The economic or the discussion about economics is very much reduced to being or using or following a market-oriented approach and a perpetual agreement to specific economic elements plus a few statutory elements around it. In the United States, this whole discussion is much, much wider. There are think tanks around of all kinds of think tanks. This is something which we haven't got in Germany. This kind of division of labor, well, they can afford doing that. They're integrating something like this into the work of a government is difficult because we've got revolving doors between government, science and economics. This, is positive. This is beneficial for them, particularly when it comes to collision of interests. But in this way, it is much easier to, say, present ideas much easier than in Germany.
Well, I do agree. However, things are changing. Look at the chief economists at the Ministry of Finance, of Economic Affairs, and in the Federal Chancellery. You see that they are brilliant economists who move from the industry into the political realm. And this is new. This is nothing we would have had 10 years ago. However, we clearly need independent experts. The Council of Experts is giving advice to the government, to the opposition, to the public, and it's autonomous. Well, there are lots of experts for politicians. And it's not economists only. But then there are the members of the staffs of the ministries who also act as advisors. So if you go and distinguish full-time counselors and professional advisors, it's going to be difficult. And in terms of independence, I'm not sure whether this helps. Well, we have to be careful. I'm not sure whether we can truly transfer experiences made in other countries because you have different political cultures. Of course, we can learn from others. We can also discuss whether we adopt systems used by others, but we cannot simply go and transfer or transplant a system from one state into another. We do have institutionalized bodies, experts bodies, and we have had quite good experiences with these. Example, for 6 years we have had the Stability Council, which is part of our basic law. It's a political body established by the federal government and the Länder, and its mission consists of mutual control, i.e. the budgets are being checked mutually, and in case of problems, help and support is granted mutually. This is a political body meeting twice a year. It's a bit difficult as far as politicians are concerned in general, I have to say, because politicians don't really want to criticize each other, and it's not easy to criticize the budgets of other politicians. Now, 3 years ago, an advisory board led by Mr. Milbrandt. Well, anyway, a supervisory board, in addition to this council, has been established or has worked for 3 years now. I a group of observers, and the supervisory board has a close look at what the council does, and the reports made by the supervisory board are much more explicit, so to speak, than the reports published by the council. And the work of the council has changed. Well, yeah, thank you. I'm a member of the supervisory board, and I'm very happy to note that people realize that there is such a board at all. And it might be useful indeed, but it also shows in an exemplary way what we are missing. On the one hand, it's been quite difficult for the supervisory board to get the relevant data. We talk to the lender, to the federal states, and the question has been so far whether we only assess one federal state or whether we assess the situation in all federal states. And then we also deal with the particular evaluation culture in Germany. In order to offer good advice, we need data. Politicians thus have to agree to make data available, and we need the laws in order to evaluate, first of all. For example, what impact does the Betreuungsgeld, the daycare money we pay to parents whose children are not sent to kindergartens has for the secondary income situation of a family, was a question we wanted to ponder. But then there are also lots of programs where the initiators don't want any assessment at all. And, of course, the population at large does not want to make data available. Schools, that's a particularly difficult subject matter. It would be much easier to understand how schools work, but the citizens don't want to disclose their data. They don't want to give any information, any data concerning their children. So that's the most important question, i.e. evaluation culture. That's what it's all about. Well, transparency, that's what it's all about. We need as many data as possible, and we need as much of a discourse as possible, and the discourse should not be a scientific one. I mean, people tend to say that lobby groups, interest groups are a problem, but they are not. These groups are good as long as they help show what impact certain programs and projects have for the public at large, which is more than many a professor can do. So we need accompanied processes. We need these interest groups. We need the ministerial bureaucracy and others. But then, of course, you can also go and say we don't want to look at the data because the voters live in another reality, but that's nothing to make sense. Now the floor is open to the audience, and please, if you take the floor, introduce yourselves and tell us who you are asking. Thank you for this interesting debate. I'm Martin Kleist, representing Die Zeit in Berlin. I lived the last 7 years in America. And my question is a question for all of you. There is, if you ask me, still a long way to go as far as the German counseling culture is concerned. And the problem I see in Germany is there is no applied counseling, and experts are not practitioners in many cases, and the revolving door is an important prerequisite in order to get a chance to present pragmatic solutions. The U.S. president, I guess, gets a lot of advice. There are dozens of people sitting around him, and he asks them about options for action. So don't you think that the structures have to change fundamentally? I don't agree. because I think the counseling services we offer are very practice-focused. We looked at family programs in the last few years, and all major economic institutions were involved in the study, and I think the study was a very practice-oriented one. The question is, what do politicians do with the knowledge gained in such studies? Lots of results simply disappeared, were stowed away in a drawer, so to speak, because they did not correspond to what politicians wanted to see. Well, I'd say all in all, we see a lot of counseling, and we cover a broad range, i.e. fundamental research, but also legal competence, scientific, social, political competence. All this is what we get. However, in public, we often don't see the specific consulting projects. I mean, there is also a special market as far as corporate consulting is concerned as compared to politics. This might be helpful as long as facts are delivered, which are different from what politics often get, but it's getting difficult there where consulting services or counseling services are only used as tools. Let me give you an example. In 2009, Vittorio Zoil asked me to work on a draft proposal for a law, and that's what I did, and the IGF did the same. My proposal then disappeared, and 5 years later I told a journalist of FAZ, and then the journalist made an interview with Mrs. Vittorio Zoil and asked her what happened to Mr. Paulus's proposal. But otherwise nobody had ever heard about this proposal, and that's political counseling, and that's a very realistic example. So I'd like to agree it works, but it's not very open yet. Sven Hansen, I'm an architect. Global, it says in the title of this roundtable. But as Mr. Paulus has said, we are talking about us and about Western democracies. What about China? Where do you see the future? And is the scientist free from ideology in Germany, I wonder? Well, the scientist and scholar, the expert, is free from state obligations. There are no strict state rules according to which the expert has to act. It used to be different in East Germany, as you know. Now, the principle of freedom is being recognized and accepted in Germany. It's also part of the basic law. Nevertheless, the unlimited freedom of the expert has often been considered a problem, and it's not always easy for the expert to defend his or her positions, i.e. research in Germany has not always been easy, in particular as far as economic research is concerned. Remember 2007, 2008, this was maybe a failure of the global economic system, but in Germany it's being considered the failure of an economy. I mean, it's like going and saying we are seeing Ebola, so we don't need any doctors anymore. They couldn't prevent it. Or a volcano erupts, so we don't need seismology anymore. Now, the fundamental doubt is what I'm talking about. And maybe we should also look at another field, i.e. sciences, natural sciences, for this purpose. The public wants to have a closer look at animal tests or genetic engineering, but only to a certain extent. Not many want to know each and every detail. And the problem of political debates today are problems of differentiation. Experts want differentiation, whereas politicians don't want to offer it in each and every context, in spite of the fact that they want to convince others. Two comments. One, in addition to what Mr. Wolfgang Schön has just said. I mean, 15 years ago, it was still possible to quote the professor from Heidelberg in order to keep a minister of finance from being appointed. But seriously, do we want the Chinese system in which politicians go and say, this is the way we do it, full stop? Well, it's easier in many respects. An architect asks this question. I mean, architects don't have freedom in Germany or in Europe, but the visionary buildings you develop on a sunny Sunday afternoon, you can build in China because a politician goes and says, this is the airport I want. There are no consulting bodies. There are no additional data required. You just go and do it. Well, but now I need to be very, very careful. And I'm just back from North Korea. And I'm kind of Asia damaged. But I would like to say I'm not quite sure what I want to live in such a world. So it might cause a number of problems. The system we're having here, but I still prefer to a dictatorial or quasi-dictatorial system. And by the way, I don't believe that this is the system we will eventually have. I don't think that we can do away with the discursive approach here. We won't have the Chinese system here, I'm sure. Jan van Hoven, and I'm a journalist. And I have a question concerning your independence, i.e. there are more and more major corporations, big companies that get involved in universities. They invest money. The Technical University in Munich, for example, gets money from major corporations. The question is, can you act independently if your university department is being sponsored by a company? What about the results you present? Now, that's certainly a pertinent question. And it also is a question for study centers or research centers, because the question is always, who's the client, who pays for the study? Now, there are two answers. First answer, it's very important to have policies at the universities, and at your universities you need to be very clear in your approach at a university. In other words, you go and say, we are happy about any support we can get from big companies, but this does not have an impact on our studies and will definitely not influence the results of our research. And as far as commissioned research is concerned, I'd say that an institution should never depend on one sponsor only, no matter whether it's a federal government, a regional government, or a private company. You always have dependencies, vested interests. So if you accept money, you have to be very clear about what this means, and you need to adopt clear policies. But there are such policies. Now, maybe in addition, there is always a danger of being dependent if you don't have enough money at your university, if universities lack money. There are lots of faculties which don't get any funds from the regions, from the land governments anymore to carry out research. And that's a danger. But then a professor must be free to say no when being commissioned. Secondly, transparency. We need to see the background. I mean, that's very important for the publication of your research results, because otherwise they can't be understood. And then there is also a major dependence, which is not involving economists or lawyers, but technology, i.e., there where research companies start hiring universities to carry out their research. And that's a very difficult situation. On the one hand, this is why the industrial side of Germany is powerful and strong, but then it needs to be refreshed and there needs to be transparency, because you don't want to have someone writing his doctor's thesis work as a mere slave of the third party that funds the program only. Let me add that this is a very difficult question, and it's a very important question. It's difficult to answer because we have to see the legal framework conditions, and we have to bear in mind that this is about human beings. At the Tianjin University in Shanghai, there is a German-Chinese faculty of law with 5 chairs. Volkswagen, Siemens, and so on and so forth have sponsored chairs, maybe even 6, 5 or 6. I had an opportunity to see the founding conditions, which state that the freedom of research is guaranteed. It looks nice on paper. But then you have a human being who occupies the chair. He's a professor or she, he's an individual or she, and maybe the Volkswagen chairman of the board comes to see him, and the question is whether this can be kept free from any human influence, but it's clearly difficult to control. So that are dependencies, maybe at least, but they are institutional, and we need to be clear, and we need to make sure that these don't have too much of an impact.
Mein Name ist Rainer Bonschap. Among other things, I study negotiations, or the way of conducting negotiations. When looking at Greece and the development, there was a point when, or it is thinkable that both parties really acted in an absolutely wrong way. Now, whether this is right or not, this is something else. But do you know whether the government has got, say, experts who watch this entire process like Roger Fisher did in the United States over many years? That's one question. Second question is the Brexit. Well, that was something, and I do not know whether this was studied. You know, politicians sometimes said that this is the demise of Europe, and then temporary Brexit was touched. And do you know whether whether scientists, you know, gave advice, or whether the government really started thinking about this Brexit? You know, currency space, and Greece, I'm sure it will be a subject of our second panel discussion. And of course, maybe we should only discuss those things which go beyond the mere topic. Well, briefly, it has never happened. So in this case, even the scientists do not really know what can or will or would happen. Talking about advice, I would approach this subject like this. What is the worst case? What is the worst outcome? You can imagine and think of various scenarios, and here you might say, what is the worst outcome if Greece leaves? Can we live with that? And what is the worst case if Greece stays within the Union? And I'm sure there are really very, say, high levels of insecurity if you do not know what to base your ideas on or deliberations on. You see, this is a singular, this is a discrete event, something which has not happened in the past, so it is very difficult. I admit I do not know whether there had been any kind of advice, but you also touched on the process per se. Now, if there had been some kind of mediation, it's a classical, aspect here, classical mediation. If this would have been helpful, well, as far as I know, this never played a role, at least not during these ongoing negotiations or while the negotiations were going on. Mediations in this respect, I think this is something which is advisable. Okay, let us have the wheel come full circle. Greece leaving the Eurozone, future of the Eurozone as a whole. Now, scientists, politicians, and even the press sometimes were criticized for publicly voicing, say, unpopular ideas. The question of Greece leaving the EU might even have positive repercussions for Greece, but this does not tally with the idea of one Europe. Then, of course, it is hard sometimes. And other ideas have been, say, put forward. Europe being split between the North and the South. I'm not the one who is the decision maker, but I think it should be possible to discuss these issues in the public. This is something which must be guaranteed, and over the last few years it was my impression that this was not guaranteed. I think we've got time for one last question. Yes, please. Well, Wolf Metternich, one question. How do people want you to take on this responsibility, or how is this judged? Is there a way of looking at an issue afterwards and, people start forgetting things? What about, say, quality assurance in this respect? What kind of advice was given? And maybe we also want to find out and maybe even test what was the quality of the advice. How was it? Did it take into account everything? I think this is a good question. I can come up with this idea. People always ask what you did not, what kind of advice you did not give. For instance, whether or not the Experts' Council approached the Financial Ministry asking whether or not the Experts' Council really thought about such issues even before the economic crisis happened. And I can say we found a presentation, and Mr. Conrad had written that, where in 2005 such situations had been discussed. So we can say, yes, we dealt with this an issue, but I'm sure I don't answer your question. I think your question was, what would have happened if people did not find such an essay or report before a crisis happens? I do not know what the situation would be, but anyway, there are such queries, there are such inquiries. So I think here we can wind up the first panel discussion. I would like to thank you for your participation, your lively contributions, and the panelists for their insightful opinions.